Buckle up, everybody, because today we're taking a deep dive into the world of aviation.
We're tackling a question with some serious altitude today.
How on earth can we make flying sustainable?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And luckily, your listeners have sent us IATA's Policy Net Zero CO2 Emissions Roadmap to try to figure that out.
And let me tell you something, it is dense.
It's a beast of a document for sure, but it is a fascinating look into how the aviation industry,
At least according to IATA.
thinks it can get to net zero emissions by 2050.
And to be clear to the listeners, this roadmap that we're talking about, it's written for policymakers.
Yeah, if you've ever felt like your voice doesn't matter, this document is proof that someone out there is listening, and more than that, hoping to turn those policies into action.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Because this isn't just some, feel-good environmental goal that IATA's putting out there.
They make it crystal clear, getting to net zero by 2050. It's essential for the industry's economic survival.
Yeah. They're basically saying, get on board with sustainability or get ready for some serious turbulence ahead.
Yeah, and to be fair to them, they admit right off the bat this is not simple.
Oh, yeah.
Like they even say,
What is it?
it's not as simple as swapping out jet fuel for some magic bean juice.
Yeah,
There's no magic bean juice.
there is not.
So,
Because if we did have magic bean juice, this would be a much shorter deep dive.
oh, this would be incredibly easy.
Exactly.
And they give some interesting stats in here about if we tried to power the entire aviation industry just on standard biofuels, we're talking, using something like 50% of the world's arable land just to grow the crops. To give
Whoa.
you some context,
50%?
50%.
That's half.
Imagine battling a 747 for a soybean field.
That's a crazy thought.
Yeah.
Wow.
So with that in mind,
Okay.
where do they even begin?
Where do they begin?
Well, they start with what's already in place,
Okay.
which is CORSIA,
CORSIA.
the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation,
Okay.
which is a mouthful.
This is a mouthful.
So we'll just call it CORSIA,
CORSIA.
which came into effect this year.
Okay, so it's brand new.
Brand new.
This year meaning 2024.
2024, exactly.
Okay.
The idea is that airlines can balance out their emissions by investing in projects that reduce emissions elsewhere.
So like planting trees or funding renewable energy.
Exactly.
Exactly.
But there's a bit of a problem.
Is there?
Big problem.
Okay.
So remember those eligible emission units? The EEUs, exactly,
Yes.
which are supposed to represent those emissions reductions
Right.
that countries were supposed to be giving out.
Okay.
Well, they're not exactly handing them out.
So the countries are.
The countries aren't.
Really?
And IATA is very concerned about this.
Okay.
They're very concerned that some countries might be tempted to exploit this situation,
How so?
maybe by holding out for a higher price for those EEUs.
So if I'm a country, I'm thinking I could make a lot of money off of this.
Potentially?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like being told you can pay your taxes in monopoly money,
Yes.
but the government hasn't actually printed any yet.
Exactly.
So what are you supposed to do?
Right, and that's the problem that airlines are facing right now.
Yeah.
So CORSIA is kind of stuck in a holding pattern.
Okay.
It's a great idea.
Right.
It's not really working in practice yet.
So what are the airlines supposed to do?
Well, they can't exactly ground all the planes, right?
They can't stop flying.
They can't stop flying.
Right.
So the report puts a lot of emphasis on Sustainable Aviation Fuel, or SAF, as the primary solution, at least for now.
Right. SAF, we hear that all the time now.
All the time.
Sustainable Aviation Fuel.
SAF.
SAF. Okay, so we're going to be saying that a lot.
It's going to come up a lot.
So we might as well get used to it.
Exactly.
But even if we ramp up production of this SAF to meet those 2030 goals, isn't that just kicking the can down the road?
To some extent, yes.
Okay.
But the report argues that focusing on SAF, particularly a type called HEFA, is the most pragmatic approach for the short term.
Okay, so
Although-
HEFA.
HEFA. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to power those massive jet engines with used cooking oil.
Like what I had last night.
Potentially.
Okay.
That's essentially what HEFA is.
Okay.
It's taking existing fats, oils, and greases and refining them into jet fuel.
So we're talking about turning yesterday's French fries into tomorrow's transatlantic flight.
In a nutshell.
Wow.
It's not a perfect solution, but it's already being used in some flights, and the technology is relatively mature.
Okay.
The report actually cautions against policies that might limit the use of HEFA, at least for now, arguing that we need to keep all our options open.
Okay. Don't knock it till you try it, right?
Exactly.
Especially when you're talking about a whole industry.
When you're trying to get a whole industry off the ground, sustainably speaking.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, let's be real. None of this stuff is cheap.
No.
So what's the financial picture that they paint here?
Well, buckle up because it gets interesting.
Okay.
IATA estimates that we need roughly $74 billion.
$74 billion.
With a B, okay?
Just for biorefinery infrastructure between now and 2030.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle, right?
That's just one piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where does all that money come from?
Well, they have a pretty radical proposition.
What's that?
Redirect those massive fossil fuel subsidies
Okay.
towards renewable energy,
Oh,
specifically SAF production.
wow. They're not pulling any punches.
No,
We're talking about potentially cutting off funding to some very powerful industries.
they are. And they back it up by pointing to the success of solar and wind energy, which were once considered way too expensive.
And now look at them.
Now look at them.
They're often cheaper than fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's incredible how that's changed.
Yeah, and they're basically saying, why not with SAF?
Yeah.
We did it with solar and wind. Why not do it with SAF?
It's a bold move.
It is.
It'll be interesting to see if that gains any traction.
Yeah.
But they're not just talking about redirecting existing funds, are they?
No, they're talking about a whole toolbox of financial incentives.
Okay, like what?
Things like tax credits for SAF producers,
Okay.
contracts for difference to help manage the price volatility of sustainable fuels.
Contracts for difference. What is that?
That sounds very complicated.
It does.
It's basically a way to guarantee a stable income for SAF producers,
Okay.
even if the market price for traditional jet fuel drops.
So they don't have to worry about.
Exactly. It reduces their risk
Okay.
and makes investing in SAF more attractive.
Smart.
Yeah,
So it seems like they're pulling out all the stops to try to make this happen.
they really are.
But is it enough?
That's a good question. That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah. Is SAF enough
Is it enough to get us there?
to get to net zero?
To net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
And they even say that SAF alone won't do it.
Okay.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
Let's talk about 2030.
2030.
Because even getting to those 2030 targets
Right.
comes with a whole other set of hurdles.
Yeah, because we're talking about ramping up production, what, 16-fold in just a few years?
Yeah, something like that.
That's insane.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And one of the things they talk about in the report is that even if we have all of this SAF, even if we miraculously ramp up production 16-fold,
Right.
there's no guarantee that we'll be able to actually get it into the planes.
What do you mean?
So as it turns out,
Okay.
almost 60% of the world's biggest airports
Oh,
have
wow.
limited access
To what?
to their fuel infrastructure.
Wait, you're telling me we could have all of this sustainable aviation fuel
Yeah.
just ready to go,
Yeah.
and we can't even get it into the planes?
It's a possibility.
Whose idea was this?
Well, it's a legacy issue.
Okay.
It's not like somebody woke up one day and said, let's make this difficult.
Right.
It's just that these fuel farms
Okay.
are often controlled by a single airline
Okay.
or like a handful of suppliers.
Yep.
And the report calls this out as a major bottleneck.
Yeah, take that.
And they really urge policymakers to step in
Okay.
and make sure that there's open access to that fuel infrastructure.
So you can have all the SAF in the world, but if you can't get it into the plane, it really doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter at all.
Right.
You can lead the plane to SAF, but you can't make it drink.
Exactly.
And kind of on that same note of freedom of choice,
Okay.
they also emphasize the need to diversify our SAF portfolio.
Okay, so not putting all our eggs in one basket.
Not putting all our eggs in one basket, even if that basket is...
French fries.
Exactly.
Okay.
They specifically call out a couple of different pathways that are already in the mix.
Like what?
Things like turning alcohol into jet fuel,
Interesting.
which is already happening in some places.
Okay.
Or using the Fischer-Tropsch process. The Fischer-Tropsch process.
Okay.
Which is a fancy way of saying we can turn almost any carbon source into liquid fuel.
So from French fries to fermented corn, we're covering all the bases of our fuel sources.
We're working our way through it.
Okay.
But let's talk about those long-haul solutions.
Okay.
Because even with all the SAF in the world,
Yeah.
we're still relying on something that's bio-based.
Right. It's all coming from something that we're growing.
Exactly. So what happens when that's not enough?
Okay.
That's where these more futuristic technologies,
Like what?
like hydrogen-powered aircraft, come into play.
A hydrogen.
A hydrogen.
Every time I hear about hydrogen, it feels like,
like the future.
yeah.
It does.
Okay. So hydrogen-powered aircraft.
Yeah.
So we're not just talking about like little planes.
Yeah. No. We're talking about big commercial aircraft.
The ones that I fly in.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
But how realistic is that?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
And they get into it a little bit in the report.
Okay.
First, we need to figure out how to make a lot of green hydrogen.
Green hydrogen.
Green meaning it's made from renewable energy sources.
Okay.
Because there's no point in having a hydrogen plane that's powered by hydrogen that was created using fossil fuels.
Right.
That kind of defeats the purpose.
Right.
So we need green hydrogen production at scale.
Okay.
The other big challenge with hydrogen is that it's not as energy dense as jet fuel.
Okay. So you need a lot more of it.
A lot more of it to go the same distance.
Okay.
So that means different tanks, potentially redesigned aircraft.
Wow. We're talking about redesigning the whole plane.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Wow.
We're talking about a whole different ball game.
And the airports, too.
Oh, yeah. The airports will need a complete overhaul.
Because you're not just like rolling up a hydrogen tank to the airplane.
No. We're talking about facilities to produce it, to store it, to transfer it safely.
Wow.
And this is another area where that international collaboration is going to be essential.
Because you don't want to have a plane that can land in one place but can't refuel in another.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to be all on the same page.
So it sounds like we're talking about a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow.
But it's an exciting thought, though, isn't it?
It is.
To think that those massive planes, those symbols of our carbon footprint, could become emblems of a cleaner future.
I like that.
Yeah, it's a powerful image.
Yeah.
But we've got to be realistic, too.
Oh, absolutely.
It can't just be about, like, slapping a new label on something and calling it green.
Exactly. This is where that transparency comes in again.
Okay.
We need to make sure that everything we're doing is actually sustainable.
So how do we do that?
Well, we have to look at the entire process.
Okay.
From production to disposal.
Okay.
And that's going to require things like life cycle assessment.
Life cycle assessments.
Yeah.
What's a life cycle assessment?
It's basically looking at the entire life of a product or a process.
Okay.
From the moment it's created to the moment it's disposed of.
Okay.
And figuring out what the environmental impact is at every single stage.
So with hydrogen, we'd be looking at how is it produced?
Exactly.
How is it transported? How is it stored? And how do we get rid of it when we're done with it?
Exactly. And that way we can make sure that there's no greenwashing going on.
Right. Because it has to be sustainable at every single stage.
At every single stage.
Wow.
Yeah.
So really, it sounds like what we're talking about is a whole new way of thinking about aviation.
Yeah, it's not just about the technology.
Right.
It's about a fundamental shift in how we approach the entire industry.
And that's not going to be easy.
No, it's not going to be easy at all.
But we have to do it right.
We do.
We don't have a choice.
We don't.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
About getting to 2030.
Those 2030 goals.
Those sprints.
Exactly.
But what about the marathon?
The long game.
Yeah, what happens after 2030?
Well, before we get into that,
okay,
they actually throw in a bit of a curveball here.
Okay.
They double down on the need for something they call periodic policy reviews.
Wait a minute. Are you serious?
I am.
So we're talking trillions of dollars, decades of research, a complete overhaul of how we fly.
Yeah.
And they're worried about paperwork.
Not paperwork exactly, but you're right. This is about staying agile.
Okay.
It was about not getting stuck with these policies that sounded good on paper,
right,
but might not be working in practice. So they're basically saying, look, the landscape is going to change, technology is going to evolve.
Right.
What works today might be obsolete tomorrow.
So we need to be able to adjust.
We need to be able to adapt.
We can't just like set it and forget it.
Exactly.
So it's about building in those course corrections.
Exactly.
Making sure that we're not flying blind into the future.
Yeah, they actually suggest adding like sunset clauses to policies.
Sunset clauses? What's a sunset clause?
It's basically a built-in expiration date for a policy.
So it's not going to last forever.
It's not going to last forever. We're going to have to revisit it. We have to reassess.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
But let's get back to like the technology for a second.
Okay.
Because they mentioned something about these non-biological SAFs.
Yes.
Becoming really crucial after 2030.
Right, because remember how we talked about how Shefa is limited by how much like used cooking oil there is in the world?
Right.
These non-biological SAFs are different.
Okay.
We're talking about using captured carbon dioxide.
Okay.
Even municipal waste to create jet fuel.
Wow, so from French fry grease to actual garbage.
Pretty much.
We're seeing a theme here.
We are
turning trash into treasure.
One flight at a time.
I love it. Okay.
But these technologies are still very much in their early stages.
Okay.
So that's why the report really emphasizes this ongoing need for innovation in this area.
Yeah.
They're saying we need to invest in this. We need to support these companies that are doing this work.
Okay, so these are those technology push measures
Exactly.
that we were talking about before.
Exactly.
So what does that look like?
Well, we're talking about things like research grants, public-private partnerships,
Okay.
government procurement programs to create early markets for these fuels.
So really giving these companies that are doing this work
Yeah.
a reason to keep doing it.
Exactly.
So it's about more than just throwing money at the problem.
It is.
It's about creating an environment where those solutions can really thrive.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
But we talked about SAF.
Right.
Let's talk about the other big player in this game,
Hydrogen.
hydrogen.
Yes.
Every time I hear about hydrogen, it feels like we're on the verge of something big.
It does feel that way.
Yeah, like a real energy revolution.
It really does.
And it sounds like hydrogen has the potential to completely transform aviation.
It really does.
I mean, imagine a world where those contrails in the sky
yeah.
mean that you're looking at water vapor and not pollutants.
Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so zero emission flights, guilt-free travel.
Sign me up.
Right. But how realistic is this?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Is it really just a matter of swapping out the jet fuel for hydrogen and we're good to go?
If only it were that simple.
I know.
Right.
So first of all,
We need to figure out this green hydrogen production thing.
right, because like we said before,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense to have a hydrogen plane
Right.
that's using hydrogen that's produced from fossil fuels.
Exactly. It just defeats the purpose.
So green hydrogen production at scale, that's a big one.
That's a big one.
What else?
Well, hydrogen storage is another big challenge
Okay, why is that?
because hydrogen is much less energy dense than jet fuel.
Okay,
So you need a lot more of it
to do the same
to
job.
go the same distance.
Okay.
So we're talking about completely different fuel tanks,
Okay.
potentially even like redesigned aircraft.
So it's not just a matter of swapping out the engine.
No, we're talking about like the whole plane might have to be different.
Wow.
Do you
So it's like starting from scratch almost.
Kind of, yeah. It's a big challenge.
It is a big challenge.
But the report does lay out a roadmap
Okay.
for how we could potentially overcome those challenges.
And what does that look like?
Well, it's going to require a lot of investment,
Okay.
both from the public and private sector.
Okay.
It's going to require international collaboration
Of course.
on things like safety standards,
Right.
refueling procedures, all of that stuff.
Yeah, because the last thing you want is to have a hydrogen-powered plane
Yeah,
stuck on the tarmac
exactly.
because it can't refuel.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a huge undertaking.
It is a huge undertaking.
But it's exciting to think about.
It is exciting to think about.
The possibilities
It really is.
that we could have these airplanes that are symbols of our carbon footprint,
Right.
becoming emblems of a cleaner future.
That's the dream.
That's the hope.
That is the hope.
Wow, we've covered a lot today.
We really have.
This roadmap.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it's clear that getting to net zero aviation by 2050
Yeah.
is not going to be easy.
No, it's a monumental task.
It is. But it's also clear
Yeah.
that we have to do it.
We don't have a choice.
We don't.
We're all in this together, right?
We are all in this together, and it's going to take all of us
Absolutely.
working together to make it happen.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for coming on the show and helping us unpack all of this.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep sending us your questions.
Keep them coming.
And until next time, keep exploring.